Good evening. Welcome to Faith Family United Church of Christ Wednesday Spiritual Growth Study. This is part 3 of a 9-part study on homosexuality in the Bible. Is it fact or is it fabrication of hate? We start off by reminding everyone that when it comes to looking at passages in the Bible, there are 3 things that we need to always look at. We need to look at the culture in which the passage was written, because as you go along throughout history, your cultures change, and things that were taboo or forbidden in one part of culture become less and less as you move forward, and then the way people view things in different cultures also. So that's one of the things. The other thing is the context it was written. What was the context? Was it said something like a satirical, or was it said something as a parable, as Jesus spoke in many parables, or is it being literal and to the point of what it's trying to say? So that's another thing. You need to find the context, and that's really, really important. A lot of times when you're translating, and you always have to look at the context to find out what the word actually means. So context, and when we read it, it's also a big part. And then the third thing is, what was the audience? The audience that the text or the passage was written or directed to. What does that look like? And that, again, is going to be a big thing. So we need to remember these 3 things as we look at the different passages. There are 7 passages, as we say. These 7 passages are what will what are used as proof text to say homosexuality is a sin, or homosexuality is an abomination to God. However, we're looking at these passages, and we're going to show you that that's not the case. These are not good proof texts. These are not proof of anything other than a preconceived notion that homosexuality is wrong. So when you come to the verses with that idea, you're going to find, of course, homosexuality is wrong. But if you come there and read the passage and understand it in its context, in its culture, and also in the understanding of the translation or who it was written to, then you're going to see that this definitely isn't there. So these are the 7 proof texts that people use to bash homosexuality from the Bible standpoint, and we'll go through each one of them. Okay, the one we're talking about today is Genesis 9, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It is very important that we deal with these verses right here, because these are probably the most used verses to point to homosexuality and say that it's wrong. As a matter of fact, we've got a word in our language in English called sodomy, and it comes just directly from them trying to say that this was a text about homosexuality, which we'll talk about it, and you'll see that it has nothing to do with homosexuality. Okay, but this is probably one of the biggest ones that they build off of, and as a matter of fact, this is mentioned many, many times throughout the Bible. So let's go get started with Genesis chapter 9. First thing, context. It is important to read before what the story and after the story. What's interesting about this story is before the story, we're talking about Abraham. At the end of this story, we see Abraham injected back into the story, and then we see another story of Lot and his children. And then it goes right back into the stories of Abraham. So this is kind of, why did they stop this right here? Why did they stop the story of Abraham and interjects this story? So it's important that we look at what is being said here. Okay? In Genesis 18, for example, Abraham comes in, has three strangers visit him. We learn that they're angels. He runs up to one and calls him Lord. He treats the strangers well. He invites them into his tent. He tells his wife to go and prepare a meal. And he basically just treats them like they're royalty. And he welcomes them. And again, they're strangers. He doesn't know who they are, but he welcomes them into his house. So from there, we go into chapter 9, and that's when the angels, two of the angels, go into Sodom to talk to Lot. So you can see the story here before we get to chapter 19 is a story of how we should treat strangers or welcome them into our home. Something that many Christians don't want to do in the world today. Strangers need to stay away and stuff like that. It's disturbing to see that this was a big no-no for the nation of Israel, and God says that it's one of the reasons why He punishes them is because they don't welcome the strangers in their land, and yet here we are 2,000, 4,000 years later, and we're doing the same things as God's people, as Christians are supposed to be, and we're not welcoming of strangers. So keep that in mind as we go on too. Okay. In chapter 19, at the end, once again, 30 through 38, this is where, after the story that we're going to look at, this is where Lot and his daughters commit incest, and but they're not destroyed. They're just, it's almost like it's overlooked. Nothing is really said about it, and they said that these are the descendants of this people, and these are the descendants of this people. Both of his daughters get him drunk, and while he's incapacitated, they take advantage of him, and so. But again, nothing is said about this sin. One more thing about that. That nothing is said about that sin. It is interesting because, once again, this talks to the culture. One of the most important things in this culture is the continuation of your genealogical line. So you can see that the daughters, even though they were being kind of, they did the sin, it was to preserve life. And so how despicable that was, but that's part of the culture. And that'll come to play when we look at the words of Paul. And you'll see that when we get to 1 Corinthians. Okay, so moving on. Okay, now Genesis 19, Sodom and Gomorrah is between these two stories. The first gives us an example of how we are to welcome strangers, how God wants the stranger to be welcomed. The second is a story about two women getting their father drunk and taking him. Basically, they rape him. Okay, because as we've learned, as we've matured as human beings, non-consensual sex is not sex, it's rape. So that's important to know. Okay. Now, there's also a parallel to this story, okay, in which Judges 19 is where the same kind of situation. Okay, so let me go back to Genesis 19. In Genesis 19, the angels come, they're standing in the town, Lot goes out, he meets them, and he invites them into his house. Then it says that all the people came and said, bring them out. They want to know them or have sex with them. Again, forced sex is not sex, it's rape. But they say, bring them out. We're going to know them. And they say, Lot says, no, don't do that. Here, take my daughters instead. And they persist and say, no. The two men, the angels, grab Lot, pull him back in the house, and miraculously the people are blind and they wander away from the house. But that's a scene where there was no inviting them to some kind of a party or anything like that. They basically wanted to bring them out and treat them awful as strangers to show them who they were and that they were strangers in the land and that they had no power. That was the main thing. So that's the story. In Judges 19, we have a similar story where a Levite, that's one of the priestly tribes, is coming to a town in Judah, Benjamin, and as he's there, it's getting late, and he's standing in the square, and he's just going to spend the night in the square. And then a man comes out, and he says, "Please do not do that. You will not be harmed if you come into my house." And he invites him in, and so they come into his house, and the same thing happens. The people of town come around, and they tell them to come out, and the man goes out and pleads with them, "Don't do this. It's a bad thing." And then they offer his daughter, his virgin daughter, and the Levite's concubine, and they said no. They refuse, and they try to grab the Levite, who grabs his concubine and throws her out the door, and then they lock the door behind her, and she is essentially raped to death. In the morning, the Levite comes out, and she's holding on to the door frame, and she's dead. So, same story, a little bit different ending. But what would have been the case of the other, in Genesis, if they would have taken Lot's daughters, would they have raped them to death? And we'd have a wholly different story? Or if these people would have been struck by blindness and went away. But the point is, here you have two parallel stories right up to the end, and we don't see anything about homosexuality in there. It's about power and control, because that's what rape is about. It's about power and control. It's not about some sexual desire. Okay. So, yeah. So, once again, the only difference is in the morning, the Levite comes out, and they find that his concubine is dead. Okay. But now I want to take a closer look at Genesis 19. It says, this is Lot speaking. They're speaking about Lot. But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Again, Lot is taking the note from Uncle Abraham and doing the right thing by inviting the stranger in. Okay, but before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. This is the New Revised Standard Version, and I've got that underlined right there. All the people. Now, all the people means men and women. But what we see is, because they add the term to the last man, which isn't there. That's a translation which kind of triggers you to think that this was only the men of the town, but it doesn't say that. It says to the last man. makes you think that the whole crowd, there was no women in it, but here's what I like. The New King James Version. The New King James Version reads, from every quarter. Instead of to the last man, it says from every quarter. So all the people from every quarter. In other words, they're saying that the whole town was in on this. The whole town was in on treating these strangers, or quote unquote, teaching these strangers a lesson, how powerful they were, and don't come into our town just thinking that you're going to come in and take over. So the idea that the translation you can see here, here's the Hebrew, and the word for the people in the phrase is a masculine singular. Okay, in languages not unlike English, many of the languages have a gender ending, like you have like in Spanish. You see this a lot. Habla versus hablo, things like that. Anyway, so you have a different ending to let you know that you're talking about men or women. But the word for all people is masculine singular. So to modify, what did I say, all men? I meant all people. When we say all people, it's masculine singular. So to modify masculine singular, you have to use another word that's masculine singular. And so when you modify something, you usually want to say this is modifying this word. And so when it says all people, and then it adds a masculine singular, now you're trying to say, oh no, it's just the men. But it's not saying that. It's just because of the fact that it says all people. Okay? Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you can see how the translation, you can take that translation and make it sound like it was all the men, to the last men. Or you can translate it properly as the New King James does, and says to the last quarter. Because the actual word there is to the end. All the people to the end. So, that's a translation thing. And you can see how a translation can sway you one way or the other as to what this actually means. Now, you say, well, the translation, it's there if you translate it that way. Yes, but once again, these are people coming to the text with preconceived ideas that this is about homosexuality. And if you don't put that in there, it's not in there. Okay? So, all the people of the town were coming there, men and women, to the last quarter of the whole town, and they were trying to basically get these people out to rape them. So, you say, well, why do you translate it that way and not as homosexuality? Well, we have passages that talk about Sodom and why it was destroyed. In the Old Testament, we have two passages right here. In Zephaniah 2, therefore, as I live, this is God, says the Lord our God, the God of Israel, Moab shall become like Sodom, and the Ammonites like Gomorrah. This shall be their lot in return for their pride, because they scoffed and boasted against the people of the Lord of hosts. In other words, God's going to treat the Moabites and the Ammonites the way he treated Sodom and Gomorrah, because they were haughty and they boasted and they treated Israel in a bad way. Hence the idea not being welcoming to strangers. Okay? Read the whole Zephaniah 2 and you'll see what it's talking about there. But in the reference to Sodom and Gomorrah there's no reference to homosexuality. It's about pride. It's about being haughty. It's about not being kind to your neighbors. Okay? Again, in Ezekiel 16, this is the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughter had pride, excess food, and ease. I can't say that word right now. But did not aid the poor and needy. Again, it's about hospitality. That's the reason why Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed, not because of their quote-unquote homosexuality, because it had nothing to do with homosexuality. That was not even a thing back then. Because sexuality was not about being sexual, it was about being a position of power. That's why we talk about the men, and then we look at the women. And nowhere in the Hebrew Bible, once again, in the ancient Hebrew, there's no word for rape, because women were property. So how are you going to rape property? Okay, so it's a power thing. So now that the people come in, and you got to show them that you're in power, what better way to do that than to make them subservient like you would a woman? See there? So that goes back to the cultural thing. Okay? New Testament. Here's the New Testament passages. 8 of them that talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay? Matthew 10, Matthew 11, Luke 10, Matthew 10 again, Luke, Romans, 2 Peter, Jude, and Revelation. Okay, let's go through them real quick. In Matthew 10, 5 through 20, sending out, this is where Jesus sends out the 12. And he tells them that when they go to a town, if it does not welcome you, shake your sandals, the dust off your sandals, because it's going to be worse for them than Sodom. What? Why would he mention Sodom and welcoming them? Interesting, right? Okay, in Matthew 11, Jesus names the great cities that have fallen because they did not repent. Nothing about the sins, about if they would have seen the signs performed by Jesus, they would have repented and been saved. Did you hear that? If Sodom would have seen the signs of Jesus, they would have repented. Repented of what? Well, being non-welcoming, being power hungry. All right. In Luke, the sending out of the 70, this is kind of a parallel to Matthew 5 again. It's about welcoming strangers. Again, Jesus says, if the town doesn't welcome you, shake your sandals off, the dust off your sandals, and they'll be worse off than Sodom. And then again in Luke 17, the judgment will come like it was in any other day, like Sodom. In other words, the Sodom was there one day and it was gone the next. That's what he's talking about there. Nothing about the sin of Sodom, nothing about homosexuality. So Jesus, in mentioning Sodom, never once says it's about homosexuality. It's about them being, homosexuality. It's not about there. What he said, it's about welcoming. It's about them not treating people right. And they would have treated people right if they would have seen the signs that Jesus had performed. In Romans 9:28, an example of references to the total destruction. This says nothing about Sodom's sins or anything like that. It just talks about how Sodom was totally destructive. And 2 Peter, again, is a reference that Sodom was completely destroyed. Lot lived among these luscious, that's people with lack of moral restraint people. Okay, so now there's another word that's translated in a way that makes it sound like this had something to do with homosexuality or some kind of sexuality. because licentious kind of has the air of sexuality to it. But it doesn't have to be that. It can mean totally lack of restraint. Okay? So in other words, they didn't have any restraint. In other words, once again, not welcoming. It's all about them and not about everyone else. Okay? In Jude, it talks about the word is porneia. To engage in sexual immorality, often with the implication of prostitution. Okay, so I think this one here is probably the closest to one of the sayings that mentions Sodom and Gomorrah, where it says that it has to do with sexuality. But again, this is not something that is just, sexually immoral is how it's translated. But the idea of prostitution. Now see, that's something that we have lost the meaning of over the years. Today we think of prostitution as nothing more than, women of the night, streetwalkers or what have you, where women sell their body for money. However, the original understanding, and the reason why you call it prostitution, is because you bow down, you prostrate yourself to a god or a demigod or an idol. So that's where prostitution got its name from, because these women would live in the temples, and they would, as a way of worshiping their god, they would sell their bodies. And people would come in, or men, and women, would come in and they would sleep with them, and they were temple prostitutes. In other words, this was a way of worshiping whatever god it was. So, when Jude 7 says sexual immorality, the word there has the implications of being a prostitute or a temple worship. And worshiping other gods. And there's another word there. It's sarx, and it says to go after strange flesh, and what that means is they say strange flesh. Oh, that's talking about they were, obviously unstrange flesh is when a man and a woman come together. And so that means that they were going after something other than that. Well, I hate to tell you this, but a man going after a man and a woman going after a woman is not strange flesh. I think what they're trying to say there was more like something I'm going to say it, in the form of bestiality or something of that thing. And our last one for a reference to Sodom in the New Testament is Revelation, and that's reference to a future city that will hold the same name as Sodom. In other words, they'll be disrespectful and not loving of God. Okay, so as we look at the interpretation of Genesis 6, we notice that Jesus, once again, he sent the people out, and it was about if the people do not welcome you, do not welcome. It's about welcoming. So in other words, to Jesus, it was about being welcomed and not about something to do with sexual relations. Okay, so this text is about a failure to welcome strangers and attempted rape, not about something sexual. Rape is not sexual, it's violence, and it's a plea for power. Okay? So this has nothing to do with sex, has nothing to do with homosexual. Both to God, not welcoming strangers, and rape, guess what? Are abomination to God. And there you go. Any questions? We get any questions? That's it. Thank you. If you have any questions, please send us an email, and I'd be glad to answer any questions for you.